Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Money, religion, faith. Religious, not religious, or somewhere in between, we all have preconceptions about what religion is and how money's involved. So today we're going to look at that history. Have money and religion always been intertwined? What does it mean today that they are? And how does it impact all of us, whether or not we're religious? Are faith and religion the same thing? We've got a lot to cover, but today we're very excited to get to speak with the author of multiple books on the subject of religion and a renowned scholar. Timothy Beal is professor of religion at Case Western Reserve University, has authored numerous books, and has devoted his life to gaining and sharing a better understanding of faith. Tim, thanks for joining us again.
Hey, Justin. Hi, Lance. Thank you for having me again. Looking forward to the conversation.
I think it's worth noting that Tim did join us almost a year ago now, or a little over a year ago, and we got to talk about, I think what Lance and I ultimately decided was the book of the year, even though it wasn't released last year, but our interview of the year, which was The Rise and Fall of the Bible by Tim, and we really enjoyed that, so we're excited to get started. But of course, we could not begin this critical conversation without
TrueChat senior historian and an educator of more than 30 years. Here is your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
Well, we get to talk about two of my favorite subjects in the world, that is religion and money. I find them both very interesting and intriguing. And Tim, I'm going to start by sharing something with you and then seeing how you feel about it. As somebody, for me, who's not studied deep religion, but read a lot of books and read a lot of different religious pieces, as well as economic thoughts, it had never occurred to me what this article brought up, and that is the connection between the two. And that is that so much of the intellectual time of the 18th and 19th century, that was religion was part of the educational process, so that it bled into the discussion of everything, including this new idea of economics. And I just wondered what you've read or what you think about that. Because for me, it was kind of like an aha moment. It was like, well, yeah, I knew that most of the teachers, most of the schools were based on religion, and yet they taught history and geography and then economics. And so it made sense that there was that connection, but I had never really thought of it before. Is that something that you have studied and knew all along, or was that something, a different take on it for you as well?
I think that the article prompted me to think about it a little bit differently, but it's certainly a fact that, theology and theological discourse in the 18th and 19th centuries were part of any conversation about, society, sociology, science, technology, history, and so forth. And it was interesting to me that the reviewer of this book by Benjamin Friedman, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, thought that both Friedman and famously Max Weber, we can talk about him too and his influence on capitalism, or at least his ideas about Christianity's influence on capitalism. But this reviewer felt that they both were wrong in assuming that the theology influenced even those who weren't thinking about it. And I can't imagine how theology and religion wouldn't have been influencing everything in that context, whether or not one is explicitly or consciously religious or thinking theologically. So that was something that really struck me about the article. And there is this, theory that we all, I think a lot of us here early on, that is attributed to the sociologist Max Weber. It's called the Protestant work ethic. If you've never heard of Max Weber, you've still probably heard of the Protestant work ethic.
Mm-hmm.
And
most definitely.
So it was this idea that Protestant work ethic that was so important to the rise of capitalism, free market capitalism, was rooted in Calvinism, in Calvinist theology, especially in the Calvinist idea that of predestination, that there are those who are elect and will be saved, and those who are not and will not be saved. And it's not about what one does or doesn't do. Salvation is not something that can be earned. It's only a gift of grace. And we can talk more about that too, because there's a lot of interesting, stuff about that. But the Protestant work ethic, Weber argued, was a kind of response to that you sort of live in this way that's going to be successful to sort of demonstrate or prove that you're among the elect, and that you kind of deserve this. So that's been around a long time. This article was suggesting that might not be the whole story. And I thought that was really a fascinating perspective. And it is one that I've thought about before.
As you're speaking, Tim, it reminded me of a conversation I was having just the other day with our producer, Bradley. And he was doing, some study on Leonardo da Vinci. And he was remarking, he said, it's so interesting how some of these great scientists back in the day were also some of the great philosophers, theologians, and artists, and how, and I think that's one of those things, it's just kind of talking back to your book as well, where you almost are breaking down the concept of, so many people who are religious today, and even those that aren't, I think just kind of assume that, when Jesus was roaming the earth, he was carrying the Bible with him, of course, and it's like, well, no, not only was there not a, single bound book like that, but, even if he wanted to do that, it just would be impossible from a physical standpoint to carry something like that around. But that's kind of this same notion here. We almost have to break down internally all these preconceptions we have about, I think, you think of scientists nowadays, and it's almost like you think of them as the opposite of people such as yourself, and I think we have to make sure that our listeners are taking note of the idea that these people back then, so many of them were all of those things, or
absolutely,
they were much more, I don't want to say we're less dynamic. I guess they were less specialized maybe, or they viewed them as all, parts of figuring out life, which I think is ultimately what a lot of them were trying to do, right? Is this, they wanted to answer these questions. And to them, they could express it through art. They could talk about it from what they were learning through science, and they could explain, purpose through faith and religion subsequently. So talk to us a little bit about here, before we move into talking about the difference between faith and religion, or if there is a difference. How do we see a transition from these, small gatherings of people back at the rise of Christianity where, maybe money wasn't really part of the equation? How do we get to the institutionalized version of religion that we're at, where, Sunday offerings are a regular part of their regular expectation, tithing, right?
Yeah. Wow. That's a lot to,
do it all in 2 minutes too.
To think through. Well, first, what you're saying about science over against religion and how that would have been a foreign notion, in the early modern period. I think that's absolutely right. That word science, by the way, is rooted in this Latin word scienza, which means knowledge or understanding. And certainly in that early modern context, and I would say it's also a sort of a biblical idea as well, there was this notion that you study the creation in order to understand the creator. And a lot of early science was that kind of a project, that you're trying to understand the world empirically, and in so doing, understand the creator of that world, so that these were not separate. And you read someone like Isaac Newton, and you can see that very, very clearly.
Because now we've kind of separated them, right?
Writing. Absolutely. Yes.
Even when a lot of people now talk about those individuals, it's almost like, if you're talking to a scientist, right, they might kind of uphold that part of it and then just kind of ignore the other part of who they are. And same thing I think you'll find right in the faith community is they might focus on those aspects and less on, the science aspects. And I think that's a shame because, to your point, I think it's an important part of understanding not just why they did what they did, but also how they did it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and this is kind of a way into the question about religion, maybe. Sometimes I'm in a very STEM oriented university, right? Very science and engineering and medicine oriented university. And what I notice in some contexts, not just there, but more generally, is that the scientist who loves what she or he does really does have a deep experience of meaningful connection with what they are studying, and they do see themselves as coming to a kind of an understanding of the world that really leans toward an experience of mystery, of something that's greater than them. Part of the thing that separates that from religion is this notion that we have to talk about God. But can we think of that kind of, experience of wonder in relation to knowledge and understanding as a kind of religious experience without needing to refer to, a God or gods at all?
It's an excellent question, and it's one that we're going to continue to examine here, this idea of faith and religion, and kind of a question that you almost posed that I was thinking, and we're going to try to answer it coming up. Is science a religion all its own? To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
When we think of science and we think of religion, I think many of us view them as possibly diametrically opposed, right? Different ways of explaining the world. But as we've talked about in the first segment, that's really not how much of this came to be. And some of the world's great thinkers were deeply intertwined in both. And it relates to how money and capitalism and modern economics came to rise up. It was impossible to find people where they weren't actively balancing and talking about these two things. And that leads us to this question of faith and religion. And Lance and I actually reviewed this. I don't remember what the show was, Lance, but we got into this near the end of a show. And I thought it was so important just to talk about the definition of faith versus the definition of religion. And the first two definitions of both, I think, are very insightful. When we look at faith, right, the first definition is complete trust or confidence in someone or something. The second definition being a strong belief in God or in the doctrines of a religion based on spiritual apprehension rather than proof. And then when we look at religion, the second definition is the one that we pose that question, right? Isn't science in some ways its own form of religion? And I think that's not to say that it's not evidence-based, right? But to Tim's point at the end of the last segment, there's a lot of these people that feel a very deep, almost spiritual-like connection to their work. And the second definition here of religion, a pursuit or interest to which someone ascribes supreme importance. So, I do think of some of the people that I know that are passionate about science or are scientists. And I mean, that second definition, I don't think there's anything that's misleading or wrong about that. And now they might not appreciate us calling it a religion, and maybe we shouldn't. But the first definition, of course, being the one that we're more familiar with, a particular system of faith or worship. So that brings us to now, Lance, right, this question of faith and religion, one that you and I have gone back and forth on I think ever since probably before we had Tim on to share his book, but certainly since, it's been an ongoing theme throughout the past year. How do we use that in the context of money, and how religion and money not only came up together, but were by nature intertwined, because the very people developing most of our modern economics and economic theory were in fact very much doing so as a product of trying to better understand themselves and the world.
As I was listening to you two talk, I was thinking of partly a conversation Tim and I were having before the show, and that is, when I was growing up, there was this, late high school in the late 70s and into college into the 80s, this idea that had been out there coming from, if you want to say, the flower children of the 60s and the peace and the love, is that money would get in the way of your religious experience, of your faith, that if you were chasing the monetary dream, if you were going to be rich and powerful, then it was going to make it difficult for you to achieve the spiritual growth that you would want in it. And I was thinking, and Tim, I'm going to turn it over because I'll mess this up. But the whole idea of, the difficulty when Jesus spoke of a rich man getting into heaven is what I remember learning in my late teens and early 20s, is that, this idea to chase money and to live the American dream and to get as much wealth and material goods as you could kind of got in the way of, the teaching was then with the people I was around, that would get in the way of your spirituality and your growth. And I don't think it's true, but that's kind of where that's the background that I came up from.
I definitely resonate with that experience myself. I'd grown up in a conservative evangelical, context as a child up till college, and felt disaffected by that by the time I was in college. But I did go to this evangelical Christian college in Seattle and really kind of found my way back into Christianity through exactly what you're describing. It was this kind of movement, Jesus movement, if you will, that was very countercultural, anti-capitalist. It was rooted in what we call liberation theology, which was a movement that was really gaining traction in Central America and in Black theology with James Cone and other thinkers like that understood, that believed that God was a God of the oppressed and God was a God of the marginalized and a God of liberation. It was influenced by Marxist thought and theory as well. That was the context that I found my way back into Christianity through. And I remember we had professors, they were the most radical professors in the college were the ones in the religion department or the theology department. The business ones were all super conservative capitalist Christians, but the theology professors were kind of out there. And I remember they would go dumpster diving at night with students. And I remember one of them proposing to the finance committee of the college that we should reorganize ourselves economically according to the second chapter of Acts, which said that everybody in the new Jesus movement, pooled all their resources and shared them equally and didn't own anything individually, right? And there was all this kind of stuff going on. There was this kind of lay monastic movement where these former evangelical kids or former conservative kids were like living in community in a rented house on Queen Anne Hill in Seattle, trying to live like monks, and this whole focus on what we called voluntary poverty, right? So there was really this notion that you couldn't be Christian and wealthy or into money or into capitalism at the same time. They were mutually opposed. And I know, Lance, you said, I don't believe that anymore. There's a part of me that still does, even though I don't live according to it. But I do worry sometimes that I've kind of lost my integrity.
One of the challenges is, we can all talk about this. We can all know the history, but to know it and to experience it are different. And we're all products of the society of which we have grown up and lived in. And as somebody over the past decade who I think I've tried to take a very active role in, exploring and understanding my own faith, it becomes so clear to me that it's really important, and understanding, I think, is people almost feel, and we talked about this with your book, right? They can almost feel an affront when you share information that's contrary to what they have been brought up to believe. But that doesn't necessarily have to invalidate your faith or your religion. And I think it's so important to understand that there's, the faith, right, that Jesus was preaching, or rather maybe not even preaching, right, but talking with other people about and conversing with other people about, is so very different than the Americanized version that we have now. In many ways. And I think one of those, right, is that, they were the outsiders. They were not the mainstream. And there's some kind of, I don't know if it's cruel irony, maybe it's just irony, right? That the most powerful militaristic nation on the face of the planet, that, triumphs capitalism and making your own way in the world and getting a leg up and all of these things, is also one that historically has identified, right, as a Christian nation, and how those ideas, at least from a historical context, seem to be not compatible. So, why do you think we've arrived at this point?
I think at the core of what we're talking about in some ways is, back to this question, what is religion? Religion is constantly changing, and religion is, in some sense, I would argue, a kind of meaning making or interpretation. It's not about adhering to a set of doctrines or beliefs. And if we look at the history of Christianity, we can see that the one thing that is constant through the history of Christianity is change. And that's because religion is always about taking these received traditions and trying to make meaning out of them, to interpret them, in other words, in a present context. And in fact, that's what Jesus was doing. He was interpreting inherited tradition in the context of, the Roman imperial state, that he was under. And so was the early Jesus movement. We see that, and you asked earlier about how it became so institutionalized, and that's a huge, complicated question. But one short answer to it is, it began as this marginal movement, barely even visible in the shadow of the Roman Empire. But by the 4th century, it had become Roman imperial religion. After Constantine, it is the religion of the state. And so it went from this countercultural, marginalized, loosely networked movement to the hierarchical, religion of the empire. And from there, we can fast forward to our context and see how we in the United States, similarly with Christianity, have had this kind of notion that these are, happily married, that the global military industrial capitalism of the United States and Christianity are somehow not incompatible. And Lance, you and I think were in a context when we were younger where those questions were really on the table. Mm-hmm. I think they're going to come around again. I think we may be moving into a time in history that we can think of as post-Christian, and that within this post-Christian cultural environment, a kind of Christianity, a kind of faith and practice could emerge again, a kind of interpretive movement, again, a meaning-making movement that is not identified with the state and with the United States and with capitalism and imperialism and all of these things. And that might be a very a new moment, at least in the history of the United States.
I mean, you and I are coming up with the questions. Tim has all the answers. And
let me be clear. I think that religion is about the questions, not the answers. So
Yeah.
if I've provided answers, then I've failed.
I was going to defend you there because exactly you bring that up. We need to ask the questions and discuss, and that's what it's all about. Yeah.
a book of questions, right? Not a book of answers. And if we all shifted that thinking some, I think you'd have less people it's hard to say, but less people being disappointed by the Bible, right? The misleading question there is maybe not that you can't find answers, but the idea that the book contains the answers versus the book containing the framework to help you find the answers.
I think it's true for religion too, or at least it can be. And this gets to what you were raising earlier about, many folks, especially younger people, will say that they are not religious, but they are spiritual, or that they have faith. They're looking for alternative terms for talking about their own, I would call it, religious interests and inclinations. And that's because the definition of religion has been so narrowly framed as basically like, adhering to a set of teachings. And if you look at the data, like from Pew and other places like that, about why so many, especially millennials and younger, don't identify with religion or don't consider themselves as religious or think of themselves as nones, N-O-N-Es, it's the so-called teachings or doctrines. If you think about religion as being part of a community where you're asking and exploring questions, that makes it, I think, attractive in a different way for many people. And I think that, we don't have very many spaces in our society today to ask open questions. There's a lot of pressure in our mainstream culture to have the answers and to be settled on things.
There's not a lot of places in society that you can ask and share open thoughts without, feeling like you come under fire. But that's what this show is, and that's what we're trying to do, right? So how can people contact us if they'd like to share their thoughts and questions?
Well, they can send us an email, right? podcast@thestateofus.org, and let us know your thoughts. Many of you have been doing that. And that's the whole reason why we do this show, is as to Tim's point, is we need to get that dialogue going. We need to maybe slow down, stop, in my opinion, this cancel culture, because when you don't have the discussions, then no growth takes place and no learning takes place.
Lance and I have more to talk about in the third segment, some of our takeaways from today. But as always, we want to take a moment and give a big thank you to Timothy Beal. He's got some great books out there, folks. If you haven't read them, highly suggest that you do. We are pleased to call him a friend of the show and really appreciate, Tim, you taking some time to speak with us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Justin and Lance. I really enjoy these conversations. Thanks for having me on again.
If people want to stay up to date with what you're doing, what's the best way for them to do that?
You could, I have a website, timothybeal.com. That's probably the easiest, and it links to the stuff I'm doing at my university and publications and that sort of thing. I've got a book that'll be coming out in about a little less than a year, so maybe we can talk about that sometime.
Fantastic. I look forward to it. Tim, thank you so much. timothybeal.com, folks. The man, the myth, the legend. And you can find out more and share thoughts with him as well.
We've got more to come. Lance and I's takeaways coming up. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
We had the opportunity to talk with Timothy Beal. He's a professor of religion at Case Western Reserve University, a friend of The State of Us, and somebody who we've had the opportunity to talk with in the past about the history of the Bible, how it came to be, And I think it's just such a insightful opportunity, Lance, to share with our listeners where we get to, because it's not about, and we want to be clear about this, it's not about destroying people's belief system. It's about making sure that you understand where it comes from and where we're at now. Because I think you talked about cancel culture at the end of the last segment, Lance, and I think that's so important that people understand is if we can have these conversations and not take it as an affront. My thought when we were reading the history that Tim provides us in Rise and Fall of the Bible was just, wow, right? This is something that everybody needs to know, and this is just so impactful, and it didn't have to be a affront to what I thought or felt. It could be an opportunity to learn and grow. And I think that's, to me, that's the big takeaway when we talk about these subjects, because understanding that money and religion, it's impossible to separate how they came up, because so many of those people were exploring those ideas. And my conversation with Bradley about, isn't it fascinating how back in the day, air quotes there, so many of these great thinkers were also great scientists and great artists and great writers and philosophers. And it was a much more integrated, I guess, maybe less specialized approach.
Well, I think that's a very real thought there, that it's just, we get into our camps and we think that there's no connection between two different schools of thought. How can you be religious and talk about the economy and money? Or how can you, and you get into that, as I'm thinking there, as I'm saying that, separation of church and state. Well, okay, but it's still, all of that affects you, right? I mean, it affects the way you live and the choices you make and the decisions you make. And, there's this whole idea of, the historical idea of the gospel of wealth versus the social gospel. And, the idea that, Carnegie kind of said, if you're wealthy, then you have the, demand on you to make sure you use that wealth for the betterment of society. But then you have the social gospel movement, which was counter to that. That's talked about in this book review. The social gospel movement is then, well, but you can't have this money because you have to worry about doing good in society. And then with what Timothy said at the end of the segment there, when he talked about it, Constantine and Christianity becoming the state's religion, I just wrote down, so the power structure adopts religion to cover their power grab. And I'm like, is that what are we involved in that now? When you put that with what Timothy said, are we seeing a post-Christianity movement here? Right now, the picture that I get is this, conservative right movement using churches and religion to keep power. And yet we're also seeing people walk in the streets and say, we need social justice for Breonna Taylor. We need social justice for, Black Lives Matter. We need social justice, for, unfortunately, this violence that's taking place within our society towards Asian Americans. And so it's like, there's that juxtaposition of, we're using, one segment of our society is using religion to capture and maintain power within our political system. And then you have this other side of people protesting and saying, we got to treat people better. We have to pay people a living wage. We have to take in consideration all lives and all manners of people, LGBTQ, Black Lives Matter, Asian Americans, anybody who's different. We have to become all encompassing. And then you have them diametrically opposed within our power structure.
Why did money and religion become intertwined? Why did, why they became intertwined is because they came up together. Why they stayed that way, I think, goes to exactly what you're talking about. And this is the same reason, right, that we Americanized Christianity to fit our ideals about our country and to justify the things that we do. And there's debate and room for all of that. But to me, the thing that was the takeaway is just, we think that we're on opposite sides all the time. And so often it's just two sides of the same coin, different ways of explaining the same thing. And I was just, the Einstein quote came back to me again, and I've mentioned it before on the show, but I thought there's this great conversation about it. And I'm referring to when Einstein said science without religion is lame, religion without science is blind. And there's a lot of debate around, was Einstein religious? And he famously had said he's not an atheist. I thought this one particular quote kind of sums up part of our conversation, because a lot of it focuses right around this idea that science studies nature and figures out what's going on in the world, and religion explains it differently through blind belief. And Einstein's letter to this little girl, he writes, "Everyone seriously engaged in science becomes convinced that the laws of nature manifest a spirit which is vastly superior to man, and before which, with our modest strength, we must humbly bow." And the discussion goes on to say, well, what did he mean by spirit? What does he mean by nature? And I think people are missing the point. What Einstein meant is they're one in the same. We're talking about the same thing. We like to try to define God as a very specific, entity, being, specific morals, and that he's, personally concerned with our well-being. And there's a lot of debate to be had around that, right? But I think the thing that we miss with some of these great thinkers is that to them, it was so obvious that we're all talking about the same thing, no matter what we call God, no matter whether we're saying it's nature and we're explaining it with science, or we're looking at the Bible and explaining it with scripture, we're all seeking the same answers.
That's true. And while you're speaking, I just have to, name drop here Benan Duran and Cosmos and my trees and the bees, and how, okay, if nature doesn't show that there's some kind of intertwining of all of us, I don't know what is. But yeah, our mission here at True Chat is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And we've done that again today, I think. And that's the whole benefit, folks, right? Like we've been saying, just we got to talk. And the more we can talk to one another, the more we can find our similarities and discuss our differences and find a common ground where we can create a better world. And if you listen to the show and you're talking to your friends about it and they say, well, how can I listen to it? Then tell them we're on as a podcast, and they can find us on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and anywhere podcasts are found.
The State of Us is a syndicated radio program available on the weekends throughout the United States in select talk markets. We're also a podcast released Tuesdays and Thursdays by 4 a.m. Eastern. We'd love to hear from you. Send us an email, podcast@thestateofus.org, podcast@thestateofus.org. Lance and I read every one of them, not always as fast as we'd like to, but we do read every single one. And so far we've managed to reply to everybody that sends something in. So please take that time, because we do like knowing what you're thinking out there and if you're getting value from what we're doing. For the State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our producer, Bradley Butch, and thank you all, our audience, for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.